Hey Hannah, I know we did a longer video and a tour of your garden here, but I want to take a moment to have you explain a little bit about how to harvest flowers and basic bouquet building.
Yeah, absolutely. I can show you a little bit about that. We are standing here by a bed of Rudbeckia, which is one of my favorite summer blooming flowers that has such kind of a fun range of color and really great texture. And I've got a lot of these to cut. So when I come in here to harvest flowers for an arrangement, I want to make sure that they have a sturdy enough stem that they aren't going to droop immediately. A lot of flowers, summer flowers, you can kind of do this stem check. Let's try this one, where you give it a little bit of a wiggle, and if it's not ready to cut, you will see kind of the flower really flop around. And so this one looks good to cut. This one also looks good to cut. Let's see if we can find one that's not. That one looks a little too wiggly, so I'm gonna leave that. I think it would take a nosedive pretty quickly. So when I go to harvest the ones that feel sturdy enough, I'm gonna go down to a leaf node, and I wanna cut pretty long stems.
Okay, so you're cutting right above the node or right below the node?
Right above the node, thanks. And you're gonna cut on an angle with a really good, sharp, clean pair of snips. Right above a leaf node. And then I've got this stem. And ideally you could even cut further down on the plant and get a really long stem, because the more you cut, the more these cut and come again type plants are going to produce and keep sending up new flowers. So continuing to cut and cutting really long stems, it feels a little bit counterintuitive because it feels like you're chopping off a lot of the plant, but it's actually really good to keep growth regenerating. But before I put this in a bucket of water, which I always have nearby when I'm harvesting, I'm going to strip any leaves that would be under the water line, because any leaves that are under the water are going to start kind of decomposing really quickly and creating bacteria. So to keep the water nice and clean, I'm going to strip the stem, and then that is ready to go in the water and ready to go to the studio and into the cooler for us to pull from for our design work.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a lot of basic questions here.
Yeah.
How long do you want it? Is that based on the overall design of the bouquet? Is it based on the type of flower that you're cutting?
That's a really good question. So typically I will cut it about 18 inches, which is kind of a good height for sitting straight up in a bucket. So it kind of depends on the size bucket I'm using, because I want them to kind of stand up tall in the bucket but not be really flopped over the edge of the bucket. But if I'm making a really tall arrangement, like we sometimes do for a bar, or if we're doing a big installation where we want to have really tall materials, then I would make sure to cut really super long stems. But for the kind of specific use of just bouquets and small arrangements that we're making in the studio, a stem of about 12 to 18 inches is plenty long. I've just taken a walk around the garden and cut a bunch of different fun materials that I would use to make a bouquet or an arrangement. And it can be really tricky as a grower to decide what kind of mix you need to grow so that you, or so that a florist can grow or can arrange a really nice bouquet with what you've grown. Or even if you're a home grower, deciding, you know, what's a nice mix of materials that I can consistently bring beautiful flowers into my home. And so whenever I build a bouquet, it starts with foliage, and although it can be really easy to focus on the big showy flowers, the foliage is really key too. So what I've pulled, and I didn't strip all of these stems as I was cutting, but this is lemon balm, which is a medicinal herb that I love because it gives you nice height and a nice kind of line. Always want to think about a mix of different shapes. The second thing I've cut is shiso, which I love in the kitchen, but is also a really, really beautiful addition to arrangements because of that double-sided leaf. And I've also cut this mountain mint from my perennial bed, which is really fun because it has that nice texture and it is a beautiful silvery shade of green. So these are just 3 examples of foliage that I grow that have a lot of different uses, but bring aroma and nice shape to build out kind of the base of a bouquet. And then the next thing I think about are the focal flowers, which are the big sort of round, showy flowers that are going to be the focal point of any bouquet. My favorite, one of my favorites, summer flowers is this giant orange marigold. And these create an awesome focal point. And they also are such fun.
So in terms of the focal flowers, is that just something large and colorful, or what are you looking for?
It's just something large and kind of front facing. So whatever your eye is drawn to, which doesn't necessarily always have to be a super perfectly round flower, but anything that is really going to be the central focus of the arrangement, and you kind of build everything else around that. And so whenever you're using focal flowers, it's important to kind of stagger the height and think about collecting pieces of different sizes so that you get natural variation like you would see on the plant. So I've pulled a few of those, and I won't really build a bouquet, but I'll show you the mix of things that I would pull. Rudbeckia is the next one, which is also, it works as a focal flower because it has this round face, but it's a little bit smaller than my marigold, so that's a really nice companion to mix together. And I really love the yellows alongside the oranges. And I've also got some Rudbeckia that pull in some of that really nice rusty orange shade as well that are really pretty next to the marigolds. So we've got a fun color palette going of sort of golden hour, beautiful oranges, reds, yellows, and the shades are really sort of blending in between the different bright colors. And so after the foliage and the focal flowers, you also want to think about filler ingredients, because if I only had greenery and focal flowers, there's really a lot of empty space left, and I don't have a whole lot of movement and body yet to my shape. And so the other materials you want to think about growing are tall ingredients, which a foxglove is a really good example of a tall ingredient. You want to think about filler, which could be something like this buckwheat, my cover crop right now, which also happens to be a really beautiful filler flower that I could just sort of pepper in throughout a bouquet. And then also kind of smaller faced flowers that just are kind of play a supporting role in the bouquet, but have really nice character and shape and just really add interest beyond your focal flowers. So that one was Scabiosa. And I've also cut some of these white cosmos, which have a beautiful kind of arcing shape to them. And those help to fill out the shape too.
So when you go out to harvest flowers, do you have an idea of what the bouquet is going to look like ahead of time? Or no, okay. Because I know you just mentioned you want sort of different sizes for your focal flowers.
Yeah. So I rarely know exactly what I'm going to make, which is the really fun part about being a gardener and also a florist, because I can take a walk around the garden. Usually I do have a color palette in mind, but not always. And so I'm kind of thinking, well, I really want this to feel really sunny and summery. And so I'll kind of let that guide what I cut, because otherwise I would be overwhelmed by choices. So I try to think about pulling from within a color family. But other than that, I just kind of let, almost like a chef choosing produce, let the most beautiful specimens kind of guide the design,
so
rather than trying to force anything.
Yeah, cool. So if you were to break it down in real simple, basic steps, what were the main characters in the show here?
Yeah. So the main characters in the show are your foliage, your focal flower. Some people call a tall flower a spike, and then a filler. And I like to have lots of different kinds of fillers. I usually think about fillers in terms of something airy, which is probably kind of think about something that has a little bit of sparkle and movement to it, and also just a smaller faced flower that can kind of bring some arc and shape and like liveliness to the bouquet. So foliage, focal, and filler are the main things that you want to think about, but then within those categories pick maybe a few different kind of textures or shapes within those categories.
Okay,
and then
so
you'll have a lot of variety.
That is such a great starting place, I think, especially if you're overwhelmed with how to put your flowers that you have growing. Now, when you are planning your garden, do you think about like, oh, this would be good for this thing or that thing, or you just grow what's cool and you just make it work?
So it's a little bit of both. I definitely will think about the events that we have planned for the year and the color palettes that we have chosen for our clients, and I'll try to grow plenty of options within those color palettes. But beyond that, I always try to kind of pick unexpected varieties and let those sort of surprise me in how we get to use them. So, for example, we don't do a whole lot of color palettes that involve a lot of sort of like lavender blue colors, but you come up with unexpected color combinations that you didn't know you loved if you grow a bunch of stuff that's kind of way outside of what you would normally make for a wedding. So for example, this really bright orange and this sort of lavender blue is a color combination that I really love, but isn't necessarily one I would have pulled for a wedding. So it's fun as a creative person to have some old favorites and have some things you know people will definitely buy, but then also make sure to feed your creative spirit too and pull some things that you think will be unexpected and fun to play with.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, some nuts and bolts here. You just got a bucket of water.
Yes.
Because I got to get technical with you for a second.
Absolutely.
And then, so what happens? You get your bouquet together, and then what do you do with it then?
So I've got, to start, a very clean bucket. It's really key that you're not introducing any bacteria into the equation. So super clean bucket, super clean water. The flowers go straight into the water, and then we have a walk-in cooler at our studio. So I harvest flowers early in the morning or late in the evening and then drive them straight to the cooler. And that way they can kind of get conditioned and get hydrated before we design with them. You do not want to go straight from cutting flowers to designing with them because the chances of things taking a nosedive are high. So you want to make sure they have an opportunity to really kind of get acquainted.
Okay, and how long do they have to cool down for?
At least a few hours.
Okay, so you can transfer them and then cool them down, and then
you can start working with them and designing with them. You can kind of do a check and just kind of by feel see how hydrated they feel. A lot of times with foliage especially, you'll see things droop, but then once they're in water and in the cooler for a few hours, you'll see them perk up. And so anytime you see anything that's looking droopy, give it some time in the cooler. If it doesn't perk up, it goes to the compost pile, but anything that, you know, does perk up in the cooler, that's a good indication that it's ready to use.
Sounds a lot like vegetables too.
It's a lot like vegetables.
Really,
yeah,
we're growing
yeah,
stuff.
Common sense. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for the information. I think it's helpful for home gardeners and people looking to put together bouquets, maybe for a, bring into a farmer's market, something like that. I know a lot of market gardeners maybe are thinking about dipping their toe in the cut flower market. So
absolutely, yeah. Grow a fun mix of stuff and always, have a nice variety to play with because it makes the job more fun too.
All right, you make it look so easy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.